Good morning. What I'm hoping to do with this short presentation of the work that I've been working on these past few years is to maybe expand our conversation a little bit and reinforce the idea that the context in which a sound is produced is perhaps as important as the sound itself. And in this case, of course, we're talking about music. I should give a little context, a little background. I am an architect, and I'm with a specialty in heritage and heritage conservation. So that's my perspective that I bring to this type of work. And in the project that I'll present to you, I try to use sound as both evidence of a historic past, as well as really a methodology of investigation. And I draw a lot from psychoacoustics and soundscape in order to do that. The site that I have been researching for a number of years is pretty old. It's an ancient sanctuary to Zeus, located in one of the tallest mountains in the Peloponnese, which you see here. Very briefly, it is a site that was used continuously for a very long time. It was divided between an upper sanctuary and a lower sanctuary. I'm interested in investigating the lower sanctuary primarily, which you see depicted here with some outlines of buildings in yellow. Not much is left of the remains, however. It was active around, let's say, built around 350 BC. It was active for about 200 years. And the interesting part is that all of the buildings arrived seemingly at once. So there was a consistent design intention, perhaps. I'll give a snapshot of the lower sanctuary here with some of the outlines of the buildings highlighted. Not a whole lot more is known about the site, however, and certainly not about the daily experience of what ritualized activity would have been like in ancient times. You can see a current state of what it looks like. Now, why would I think that sound and the soundscape and the acoustics of this place would be something that could give us information, especially when there are so few physical remnants of the buildings left? I have spent a significant amount of time on the site and in documenting the architecture itself. And in doing so, I've been witness to and heard certainly stories about people experiencing something akin to sound lines, moments where you can hear somebody speaking incredibly clearly from a very long distance away, or you can hear a certain sound dropping of keys or something of that nature. But if the source of that sound moves just a few meters away, suddenly that connection is broken. Given that I was documenting architecture, a lot of the alignments that I witnessed or were present in had to do with the architecture, it seemed, and prominent landscape features or other built features. And it made me think that there's possibility that there is some kind of intention with how the buildings are placed in taking advantage of the natural acoustic properties of the landscape that were already present. And this, of course, would help facilitate communication and ritual activity across long distances of this site, as well as give us an idea, perhaps, in a way that the architecture can't, about zones of access to ritualized activity. Who could be participant in something that was happening visually versus something that was happening through music or performance, something that could be heard within the landscape. These are the issues that I try to bring to the fore by using sound as the investigative tool rather than the architecture itself. So how does this work? Well, what I need to do is bring these kind of anecdotal observations about sonic connection within the landscape into something that's much more comparative. And that's where soundscape and binaural recording comes in. So what I can do is I can set up a speaker in, let's say, one of the locations where let's say I was documenting one of the ruins. And I select a number of other sites where perhaps anecdotally I've either heard or observed some kind of perhaps sonic connection that I find to be a little bit unusual. So I set up a speaker in that one location, and then I take a recorder binaural recorder and head to all of the other locations and record what I can hear of a single control sound or a series of control sounds that can be compared later. I can then, of course, shift the speaker to a different location, repeat the process. And in doing this across the landscape, across this site, I can build up a network, a web of recordings of the connections, the possible connections, and equally, some of the isolations, the moments where I can't hear anything where I would expect to be able to, and build an idea of where there might be zones of access sonically, where there aren't visually, or that kind of thing. So just to give a really simple example of this process, I was interested in these 2 points depicted here. There's evidence of starting blocks, so where a foot race would have begun within something that's a remnant of a hippodrome. Unusual that it's in there, but that's a different story. And a little hill that's rather adjacent to it. Now, between these 2 points, there's very easy visibility. And you can see the distance is about 143 meters apart. And I was wondering how much there was a sonic connection between these two, if it would be easy to be able to talk between the two, for instance, or be able to hear a sound between the two. So quite simply, put a speaker on the starting blocks, ran up to the hill, set off the sound and recorded what I could hear, and then reverse the process. And just to visualize that in the landscape, you can see the 2 points here, separated again by about 143 meters. And you can see there really isn't that much interference physically between the two positions. It's essentially an open field condition. So I wouldn't expect there to be too many differences between the sonic characteristics of what I can hear between the 2 points. So what I could hear from the little hill, I would think would be the same as what I could hear in the starting blocks, right? So this is where I can introduce the idea of how I use psychoacoustics to my benefit. So what in order to make something comparable and also less anecdotal, I use a system of field recording, which you see depicted here, produced by Head Acoustics, which is a binaural recording system that enables me to take the sounds that I record, convert them into spectrograms later, and observe and analyze not only, let's say, the objective behavior of the sound, kind of how the sound power is moving around the site, but also how the human ear is receiving that and processing that information. That's where the psychoacoustics comes in. Now, of course, we have a very sophisticated tool in our ears generally that enables us to focus on a foreground sound versus what we consider a background sound, to filter out certain sounds. We have in our hearing certain frequencies that we're more sensitive to versus others. All of these things can play into how we hear a particular sound. But what this software package allows me to do is visualize that information and actually produce a comparable spectrogram in terms of how the human ear is receiving that information. What I use is control sounds. I use a number of them to try and cover my bases. So what you see here depicted in the spectrogram above are just a series of pure tones, which is very easy. Well, it's easier to hear in a field environment where there might be a lot of bugs and wind and that kind of thing. So I can hear a sound, I can differentiate it fairly easily. And it's also easily comparable later when I put it into a spectrogram to be able to pick out where the tones are visible or not. Now, looks like I'm going to go through just a very simple analysis of one way of how to look at this information. So these are a series of spectrograms produced from these two reciprocal recordings. At the top row here, we see what I'll call the objective sound power, the dBA. So how much of that sound is being received? How much of that sound is hitting me? And then in the second row below is what is called perceived loudness. So this is how I, as a human hearer, am receiving and processing that information. How loud am I perceiving it to be? Those two things are not necessarily the same. So if we look at what I heard on just standing on the hill, projected from the starting blocks, The spectrograms look fairly similar, and indeed, with an analysis of the data, we see that what I am objectively receiving, about 8.9 dB, is roughly in the range of 6 dB of perceived loudness. So nothing really unusual going on here. It's as I would, that what I'm perceiving is essentially what I am receiving. So that makes sense. And I would expect it to be the same in the other direction, right? But in fact, they're quite different. So objectively, the sound that I'm receiving, what's hitting me, the sound power is about 1.3 dB, but the way that I am perceiving it is effectively 12 dB. That is, what I am perceiving is almost twice as loud as what it should be. So there's some sort of amplification here that's happening. That is interesting to note and needs, of course, to be substantiated through repeated recordings to make sure that there aren't other amplifications that are happening here. But it also gestures to the idea that between these 2 points specifically, there is something of, it's not a reciprocal relationship. It presents the idea that something could be heard from the little hill might be a good place to make an announcement. It might be a good place to project sound from if you're trying to communicate to the starting blocks, for instance. But there's nothing particularly impressive or unusual about what it can be projected from the starting blocks back. So it highlights the idea there might be some further investigation about the little hill, which has, as of yet, not been done archaeologically. So this kind of process is ongoing, COVID permitting, and already a number of these kind of strong unidirectional sonic connections have come out of the landscape, which highlight especially the little hill here and kind of a center spot within this cluster of buildings within the lower sanctuary that really demands some further investigation. But equally, what we see through this is a reinforcement of the idea that there are some reciprocal sonic connections in the landscape, which aren't necessarily surprising, except one, we can highlight exactly the zones in which these are taking place, where these reciprocal connections are the strongest, but also that there is something that's happening that goes beyond what the sound power is doing. There is a perceptive element to understanding the landscape that really substantiates the kind of anecdotal understanding that, hey, you know, if I go up to this center hill, I can speak to somebody pretty clearly from the hippodrome. The archaeologists have been taking advantage of that for years. So too, perhaps, would have ancient users, ancient spectators, been able to participate within activities that were happening on the hippodrome. And that's not only fascinating, but points to where further research perhaps on this hill should take place to find evidence of that. And lastly, and equally, it's important to note that there have been some zones of sonic isolation that have come out of this, this research that in some cases are actually quite surprising. And I'll point to the arrow in the top right along this possible precession way. Of course, a precession would not only be something that's incredibly visually important, but sonically important. We can expect a lot of, potentially there's some musical components or spoken components to that. Considering the prominence of this landscape feature, visually within the lower sanctuary, one would expect, at least I did, that the sonic connection would be equally loud, equally strong, if not stronger. But in fact, there are zones along this precession way which are essentially silenced from the rest of the lower sanctuary. There's a division that was unexpected, and so that's going to require some further study and perhaps some questioning of our assumptions about what kind of participation publicly would have been possible with the ritual activities that were happening. It gives us a little bit of insight into how this site could have functioned that the architecture just doesn't show. So I hope that it points to perhaps a way that we can even think about furthering this research with the introduction of musical instruments that we know were used at the time, to be able to zone in on where could these have actually been the most fruitfully used to be able to communicate to certain places or others. There are many directions to go, as you can tell. I'm excited about the topic, but Thanks very much for your attention. I'll end it there.